Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're taking a look at GPU performance in the Phantom Liberty update for Cyberpunk 2077. The game has seen some major updates for the new DLC, and in fact the changes and improvements version 2.0 brings are just too numerous to list here. But some of the highlights for PC players include stuff like fixed AMD SMT support, which CD Projekt Red implemented with the help from AMD. And although we're not looking at CPU performance today, we are testing with the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. There's also the new NVIDIA DLSS 3.5 implementation supporting ray reconstruction, though it does require path tracing to be enabled, so right now its usefulness is a bit limited, but still, it's cool to see it included, and we already have a very in-depth video looking at DLSS 3.5, so be sure to check that out. There's certainly a lot more to talk about, but for this video, I'd like to focus on GPU performance, so let's get into that. For testing, I grabbed a save game from Tim where he's 65 hours into the game, and that explains why I can never get him to do any work. I'm kidding, of course. Well, sort of. Anyway, the save game location is Dogtown, and the test takes place mostly indoors, as the area used appeared to be quite demanding. The test pass lasts 30 seconds, and we're reporting the average of 3 runs. The game has been benchmarked using the Ray Tracing Ultra preset along with the standard Ultra and Medium presets, and upscaling has been disabled manually for all 3. The resolutions of interest include 1080p, 1440p, and 4K, so as usual, we have a lot of data to go over. As mentioned earlier, I did use my Ryzen 7 7800X 3D test system with 32GB of DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, and the display drivers used were GameReady 537.42 and Adrenaline Edition 23.9.2. Okay, I reckon it's about time we jumped into the data, so let's go do that. Starting with the ray tracing results, and again, we've gone with the Ray Tracing Ultra preset as it enables reflections, and this provides the best ray traced experience in the game. Now, at 1080p, you are looking at just 104 FPS from the RTX 4090 using this preset without upscaling, which is certainly great performance overall, but we're also talking about an RTX 4090 here at 1080p. Then with the RTX 4080, we're dropping down to 77 FPS and then 67 FPS with the 4070 Ti, while the 3090 Ti, that managed to deliver just 60 FPS. Now, although the RTX 4070 was good for just 51 FPS, that still saw at best AMD's best, so the 7900 XTX, as the Radeon GPU was only able to average 47 FPS and then 40 FPS for the 7900 XT. Essentially then, if you own a Radeon GPU, your options for enabling ray traced effects in this title, they're going to be very limited. The 7800 XT, that just broke the 30 FPS barrier, again at 1080p, placing it alongside the RTX 4060 and making it slower than the last generation RTX 3070. And then beyond this, upscaling, it's not really going to help, and FSR is particularly horrible at 1080p anyway, and while we don't recommend using DLSS either at such a low resolution, it is certainly better. Still, for those of you with an RTX 3070 Ti/4060 Ti or slower, you'll want to minimize the RT effects used, or ideally just disable RT altogether, as you'd likely enjoy much better performance at 1440p using the standard Ultra preset, and of course we will look at that very soon. For now though, let's take a look at the ray tracing performance at 1440p. Here the RTX 4090 averaged just 70 FPS, meaning the RTX 4080 was good for only 49 FPS, so you'll certainly want to lean on DLSS upscaling here, and thankfully it does work quite well at 1440p. Then we see that the previous generation RTX 3090 Ti was good for just 42 FPS on average, followed by the 4070 Ti with 39 FPS. Then delivering just 30 FPS, or thereabouts, is the RTX 3080, 7900 XTX, RTX 4070 and 3080 Ti. And then below that we do find the bulk of the GPUs tested, and none of them are really suitable for gaming at 1440p with ray traced reflections enabled, at least not using the Ultra RT preset. Okay, so we're not quite at a point in time yet where 4K ray tracing at this level of detail is feasible on anything without a heavy reliance on upscaling. The RTX 4090, for example, rendered just 36 FPS, which is impressive when compared to the 23 FPS we received from the RTX 4080. Beyond that though, there's really no saving face. Even DLSS upscaling plus frame generation feels pretty bad on the RTX 4070 Ti, at least in my opinion. Alright then, time to look at performance using the ultra quality preset, so no ray tracing here, and again please note by default this preset does enable FSR 2.1 quality, which we've disabled as we want to show results for the resolutions advertised. Now, unlike the ray tracing results, where the Radeon GPUs get completely decimated, we see that the 7900 XTX is very snappy at 1080p, rendering 184 FPS to just edge out the 4090. The 7900 XT did trail the 4080, coming in 9% slower, though it was also 7% faster than the 4070 Ti. Meanwhile, the old 6950 XT was only able to match the 3080 Ti, making it just 3% faster than the 7800 XT, which basically matched the 6900 XT. The 6800 XT and RTX 3080 were neck and neck with 122 FPS each, while the RTX 4070 and 7700 XT were also very evenly matched. In fact, almost all of the tested GPUs performed very well at 1080p using the Ultra preset. The RTX 4060, for example, that was good for 70 FPS, while the RX 7600 was even better with 77 FPS. And even old legends like the 5700 XT did well, rendering 68 FPS on average to match the 6650 XT and GTX 1080 Ti. The RTX 3060 just managed to average over 60 FPS, while the RX 6600 just fell short. Then we see that the RTX 3050 is its typical underwhelming self with just 45 FPS on average, and of course the 6500 XT proves why it's one of the worst GPU releases of the past decade, with just 24 FPS and unplayable 1% lows thanks to that 4GB VRAM buffer. Now, increasing the resolution to 1440p gives us a more accurate picture of what the GeForce RTX 4090 is capable of. With 144 FPS on average, it was 14% faster than the 7900 XTX, not a massive margin, but certainly an improvement over what was seen at 1080p. Then we see that for the 7900 XTX, coming in behind the 4090 is no big deal, and in fact, it's the 10% victory over the RTX 4080 that's a much bigger deal for the Radeon GPU. The 4080, on the other hand, was 10% faster than the 7900 XT, though given it does cost almost 40% more right now, that's still a big win for AMD. In terms of pricing, the 7900 XT is positioned against the 4070 Ti, and here it was 11% faster. Then we see the 7800 XT roughly matched the 6950 XT and RTX 3090, which is an impressive result, while the 7700 XT was comparable to the RX 6800 and RTX 4070, so a good result there for AMD. Beyond that though, we are dropping below 60 FPS with parts such as the 6750 XT and 4060 Ti. The RX 7600 was good for just 48 FPS, while the RTX 4060 managed just 43 FPS, making it a whisker slower than the GTX 1080 Ti. The old 5700 XT really struggles here with just 37 FPS, which was comparable performance to that of the RTX 3060 and 6600 XT. And then finally, the RTX 3050 wasn't really usable, and of course the 6500 XT was completely broken. Upping the resolution to 4K puts a huge load on these GPUs, and even the RTX 4090 doesn't blow miles past the 60 FPS barrier, though gameplay was quite nice with 75 FPS on average. Not ideal by my standards, but certainly playable, and of course the game looks very nice. Then we see that the 7900 XTX was right on the edge with 64 FPS, making it 15% slower than the 4090, but also 14% faster than the RTX 4080. The 7900 XT averaged 50 FPS, which placed it roughly on par with the 3090 Ti, and as a result, just ahead of the 3090, and then 9% faster than the 4070 Ti. Then once we get down to the 6950 XT and 7800 XT, we're well below 60 FPS with 43 and 41 FPS respectively. So you're really not going to want to go any slower than that, even when keeping upscaling in mind. Okay, so time for the medium preset, and again, FSR 2.1 is enabled automatically here, though this time the FSR quality level is just set to auto, so you could end up with anything really. Again though, we've gone and manually disabled FSR for all of this testing, so native resolution giving us some apples to apples results. In the past, we've found that the medium preset still offers a pretty good visual experience in Cyberpunk 2077, but shortly after this content goes live, Tim will have a Phantom Liberty optimization guide for you. Anyway, With the medium quality preset enabled, the 7900 XTX was good for 218 FPS at 1080p, making it slightly faster than the RTX 4090 and 4080, which were CPU limited. Of course, the 7900 XTX was also CPU limited, but Radeon GPUs do have a bit more headroom here, which we've covered in some dedicated content before, so that does allow them to provide a bit more performance when CPU limited. Then we see that the 7900 XT was good for 191 FPS, which is a 4% increase over the 4070 Ti and a 14% increase from the 3090 Ti. Meanwhile, the 3090 Ti, 6950 XT, and the 7800 XT all delivered over 160 FPS. Another interesting matchup is the 6800 XT versus RTX 3080, and using these settings, the Radeon GPU was 11% faster, and this meant that the 3080 was matched by the RX 6800 and 7700 XT. Again, the 4060 Ti is seen delivering 6750 XT-like performance, making both slightly faster than the old RTX 2080 Ti, which was more comparable with the RTX 4060 and 3060 Ti, along with the RX 7600, which averaged 95 FPS. We then find that the GTX 1080 Ti rendered 81 FPS, making it a smidgen faster than the 3060 and RX 6600, while the 5700 XT again struggles, this time with 68 FPS, though it was still very playable. The RTX 3050 was also playable here with 56 FPS on average, and depending on your standards, I guess the 6500 XT might be playable using the lowest quality settings that we've tested with, but the experience overall is going to be pretty bad. Once again, we find that as we move away from the 1080p resolution, the RTX 4090 starts to come into its own. With 192 FPS on average, it was 22% faster than the 7900 XTX, while the Radeon GPU was 8% faster than the 4080. Further down, we find the RTX 3090, 6900 XT, and 7800 XT, all on between 113 to 115 FPS, which makes the new 7800 XT look quite good, despite the fact that it's only 8% faster than the 6800 XT. Speaking of which, the 6800 XT did maintain an 8% margin over the RTX 3080, and performance from both GPUs was good using these settings. The 3080 was also on par with the 4070, making them a whisker faster than the 7700 XT and RX 6800. Then we see a small drop-off in performance with the RTX 3070 Ti and 3070, which were slightly faster than the 4060 Ti and 6750 XT. Still, even the RX 7600 and RTX 4060 were good for 60 FPS, but below them we find the GTX 1080 Ti with 56 FPS, which is just ahead of the RX 6600 XT and a 6650 XT. Once again, the only truly broken GPU here in terms of performance was, you guessed it, the 6500 XT. Finally, at the 4K resolution, we're still seeing over 100 FPS from the RTX 4090 when using the medium preset, 106 FPS in this example, making it once again 22% faster than the 7900 XTX. Still, the Radeon flagship rendered 87 FPS on average, making it 12% faster than the RTX 4080 and 24% faster than the 7900 XT, which managed 70 FPS on average. Below that though, we're quickly approaching the 60 FPS barrier, and we're basically there with the 6950 XT and RTX 3090, so previous generation flagships, excluding the 3090 Ti, which nudged ahead with 67 FPS. The 7800 XT and 6900 XT were right there, just shy of 60 FPS on average, as was the 3080 Ti and 6800 XT. The RTX 3080 almost caught the 6800 XT at 4K, but the Radeon GPU still enjoyed a very small 4% performance advantage. Then dropping well below 60 FPS, we find the RTX 4070 rendering just 49 FPS, the 7700 XT with just 48 FPS, and the RX 6800 with just 46 FPS. Then once again we see quite a large performance drop-off with the 3070 Ti, 3070, 2080 Ti and 6750 XT. And it's down here that we find the underwhelming current generation 4060 Ti, 4060 and RX 7600. Beyond that, the game's not really playable, so let's wrap this up. For years now, Nvidia has used Cyberpunk as one of its best showcases of its hardware-accelerated ray tracing technology, and 3 years after the initial release, this is as true as ever. Version 2.0 introduced ray reconstruction, a feature that so far is only supported by NVIDIA RTX GPUs. NVIDIA's focus here has long paid off, as RTX GPUs blow away the competition with ray tracing enabled in Cyberpunk 2077. You could certainly say that, well, that's true in general, as in GeForce GPUs blowing away Radeon GPUs with ray tracing enabled, but with most other titles using RTFX to a much lesser degree, in an effort to preserve some performance, the impact on Radeon GPUs is a lot less significant. But here, turning on ray tracing reflections, sun shadows, and local shadows kills the Radeon GPUs to the point where it's not really usable, even with the aid of upscaling. That said, most GeForce GPUs will also require quite a bit of upscaling help. And take the 1440p results for example. The only GPU that could get away without leaning on upscaling here would be the RTX 4090, as it averaged 70 FPS. The much more affordable RTX 4070 Ti though, which is still a very expensive product now that I think about it, anyway, it managed just 39 FPS at 1440p. Now DLSS does work quite well at this resolution, though enabling the quality upscaling mode, that only boosted the average frame rate to 71 FPS, which is certainly very playable, though far from a high refresh rate experience. So disappointing if that's what you're after. Now, you could enable frame generation if you have a 40 series GPU. Bit of tough luck for those of you with a 30 series GPU. But anyway, doing so bumped up the frame rate to 130 FPS for the RTX 4070 Ti. And whether or not this is a good result, that'll depend on you and your personal preferences. But personally, I'm not really a fan of how frame generation feels, and being quite latency sensitive, I'd just rather not use it. But it's an impressive technology all the same, and it's a great option to have. Beyond the 4070 Ti though, it's difficult and often impossible to reach even 60 FPS with upscaling at 1440p. The RTX 4070 for example, which is still a pretty expensive GPU, that falls short, and therefore you would have to reduce the ray tracing quality, which will result in a compromised experience. Therefore, I feel ray tracing is really only impressive if you own an RTX 4090, 4080, and maybe the 4070 Ti. Beyond that though, I'd personally prioritize a high refresh rate experience over ray tracing. That's just, for me, a much better experience with those higher frame rates. And for example, as I just noted, using the Ultra Ray Tracing preset at 1440p with the help of DLSS quality, the RTX 4070 is good for just shy of 60 FPS on average. But if you use just the Ultra preset with no ray tracing, but with DLSS quality enabled, you're looking at 123 FPS, and that is a much nicer experience in my opinion, and it's a little over twice the frame rate. And then Radeon GPUs like the 7800 XT, they also become viable. And using the 7800 XT as an example, it rendered 89 FPS at the native 1440p resolution, or 106 FPS with FSR 2.1 quality enabled. Oddly, FSR isn't scaling that well with the RDNA 3 GPU, and I suspect this is a driver-related issue, but still, 106 FPS is a much better experience than what we were seeing with ray tracing enabled. Bit of a Radeon problem there, but as I've said, it does also apply to the bulk of RTX GPUs. Of course though, this is just my opinion. I'd love to hear your opinion on this matter. What level of ray tracing are you enabling on something like an RTX 4070 or slower, if you're opting to use RTFX at all? Is halving your performance when going from the Ultra preset to the Ultra Ray Tracing preset worth it in your opinion? Overall, Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty does play very well with a huge degree of optimization on PC. Those wanting to game at 1440p using the Ultra preset and are happy with around 60 FPS will find there's plenty of mid-range current and previous generation GPUs to choose from, and that's not factoring in the possibility of employing upscaling. The game also looks quite good using the medium quality preset, and performance there is excellent. Anyway, that is going to do it for this GPU benchmark of Phantom Liberty. Be sure to check out our optimization guide, which should be available soon. But until then, if you'd like more hardware unbox goodness, we do have Floatplane or Patreon. You can sign up to either one of those. You get access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live stream, Q&A stuff, and behind the scenes content. So some pretty cool stuff there. Check it out if you're interested, but if not, perfectly fine. And of course, I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you next time.